So my name is Vince Kotchian. Just to let you know who I am, I've been a GRE tutor for a long time. I've done stuff like collaborate on GRE books. I've made video courses. I've done LinkedIn's GRE course. On Reddit, I'm the GRE, one of the moderators of the GRE subreddit. So this is really all I do. So everything I tell you today is kind of coming from the perspective of like a crusty old veteran of the industry with strong opinions about like what's good and what's not good to do. And before I launch into all the stuff I'm going to say, um, I know there's usually a variety of people at these meetings in terms of like what year you're in. What year are you guys in? Would you please all just tell me in the chat, like, are you guys first year, second year, third year? Because I want to just at least make some remarks that are appropriate for those of you who are like first year and second year, if you are. All right, Carol is senior. We got at least one second year, another senior. Ruthie, first year. Senior. Get some more people coming in. Another senior. Okay. So for anybody else, first or second year? Yeah. So we got some first and second year people here, and I'll make some remarks to you guys first because you're probably, the meeting is probably like the least interesting to you right now, if I were to guess. Like, no offense, but right, like if you're a senior and you have to take the GRE soon, a GRE meeting is probably a little more exciting than somebody who doesn't have to take the GRE in the next 2 years, right? So what I wanted to say to you guys who are, first and second years or even third years is you're the people that I wish I could send my students back in time to become. In other words, you actually have the opportunity to build skills that the GRE is going to test, whereas a lot of clients come to me with only 2 or 3 months to prepare. And it turns out for many of them that they're not really very good at math, or they're not very good at reading. Their vocabulary is not very good. Why? Well, we might say a lot of things to that, but one of the big things I would say is that, they haven't done a lot of reading over the years. They've only read what they had to for class, or they've only taken the math classes they had to take, or they never, they avoid math every chance they get, or they've never really been, if they weren't good at math, they never really tried to correct that or catch up. And yes, it's very true that those of you who are first and second years and third years probably right now, you don't have to think about like GRE prep right now, but you do have the opportunity to improve your verbal skills and your math skills so that when you do hit that GRE prep stage, you'll be stronger. It's kind of like if you picture a sport like a football player, in the off season, they're lifting weights, they're running, right? Like that's kind of your opportunity right now, so that when you try to learn GRE material, if you have been a strong reader or if you have taken math classes, the material is going to be a lot easier to get to speed with in those 2 to 3 months than it is for somebody like many of my students who have neglected those things over the years just because they didn't realize they should. So the big message I would say to like first, second, third years, like, think about, take out your calendar and schedule some, time for just like recreational reading as opposed to some of the other things you do. The more you read, the more diversity of things you read, probably the stronger your verbal skills are going to get. And then I would probably also think about like taking a math class, or, statistics is a good one. If you just realize you had a deficiency over the years, you could take like an online class of some sort. You could use Khan Academy. It's totally free, but just kind of, the GRE is going to test arithmetic. It's going to test algebra. It's going to test geometry and statistics. So it's not going to really be like hard versions of those classes. It's just going to be the basics. So if you didn't do well at one of those things, it might be a good idea to start like find some kind of like online version of a free thing to do, or maybe even an in-person class. But those skills add up over time. So those are the things, the basic things I would tell people who don't really have to care about the GRE yet. But yeah, those are, if you were to tell me like, who's going to do well in the GRE, and I see somebody who's a strong reader, a strong math person, they're going to do well. But those things take time to build. And in the course of normal GRE prep, you just might not have time, which is why I'm giving you this speech now. All right. So end of speech. I guess I'll probably make more speeches today, but the purpose of today is to we're going to actually talk about a few GRE strategies. I also think, Carol, we should probably just talk about the test itself, or how familiar on a scale of 1 to 5, I guess, 5 being very familiar with the test, 1 being completely unfamiliar. And I definitely want to hear from all you seniors here, because I think we care the most about you. How familiar are you with the test and like what's on it? 5 completely familiar, 1 you have no clue, you just know it's a test. Rachel says 4. Have you guys been studying already? I would assume if you say 4, you've probably already been studying. Carol, 4, yeah. Okay, so okay, Rachel's like, yeah, I just took it, pretty familiar. Vince, sure, okay. Well, you can be honest here. Like, I can go either way. Do you guys want to focus more on like how to do questions today, or do you want to more focus on just like an overview of like GRE prep? Like, what's your preference? And I'm really talking to the seniors here, because you guys are the ones who have to kind of deal with the tests the most in the short term. What do you think about that? More strategy, or more just like, hey, here's the test, and I'll still do that really quickly, but I also want to make sure that, if you guys are looking for advice about like strategy or how to prepare, I focus more on that. Strategy. What do you think, Carol? Yeah, strategy. Okay. Well, we'll talk a little bit about the test itself, but I'll try to keep it more strategy focused. And again, for those of you who aren't taking the test yet, maybe I think some of what I say hopefully will be memorable. So when you do study, some of this kind of like, is something you can draw from. And of course I can do this presentation again when a year from now. So let me share my screen, and then we'll get into just a few things about the test that I want to share. Just some fun facts. Okay, there we go. So let's just go through some things that are new about the test. The test is now going to be 2 hours long. So for anybody taking the test September 22nd or later, you guys may know this already, the test has been cut in half, which is great. This is kind of the nature of tests, like if a competitor to the GRE shortens itself, the GRE is kind of obligated to shorten itself too, because nobody wants to take a longer test. So now the test is 2 hours, it used to be 4 hours. There's only one essay now. It's 30 minutes at the beginning. It's like your opinion about a topic. Pretty easy to learn how to write that. And I'm going to go into how to do things for the second half of the presentation here. By the way, like how long are you going to be stuck here listening to me? Probably about 20 more minutes, just so you can like mentally calibrate like how long is this meeting going to go? So you take the test now, and there's 2 verbal sections and 2 math sections, just like the old days. The timings have changed. The 2 verbal sections are 12 questions, then 15 questions, and then it's 18 minutes and 23 minutes. Math is, same questions, but 21 minutes and 26 minutes. Still get a calculator for the math sections. Still a good idea to use it when it's going to be a pain to like do it on paper. There's no more experimental section, which is new. There's no more break, which is new. Then again, the test is only 2 hours. But the difficulty adaptation is still happening. In other words, on the first verbal section, if you do well, second verbal section is going to be harder. If you do normal or average, it's going to stay the same. And if you do badly, it'll be easier. So you want it to get harder. That's good for your score. Same thing for math. And then when you finish the test, you'll get a score just like the old days. Still no guessing penalties. So you want to guess on every question, at least fill in something for everything, and don't leave anything blank. You will still get an essay score, and then the scores you see at the bottom there, those are still average scores. For SLP programs, I don't know what good scores are really, to be honest, but I'm assuming higher than average. And I'm pretty sure we'll get into test optional stuff in a minute. But anyway, the score is from 130 to 170 for both verbal and math. So when people talk about like their GRE score, they're usually talking about the sum of the 2 scores. So maybe like a 310 is going to be a GRE score, or 320 or 302. Those are GRE scores. Essays from 1 to 6, 4 is like an average. So just some fun facts about the test. You guys can ask me questions about this at the end. But let's just talk a little bit about so let's have a look at some questions. The verbal section now has, I don't even know the numbers anymore because it's fewer of every question, but I think there's 3 of these. These are called text completion. And the big advice I would give you is when you're looking at a verbal question on the GRE, you just can't really read into anything. You just have to be super literal, almost to the point of being robotic. You can only pick things that are necessarily true or necessarily supported. And by necessarily, I mean, you can see evidence on the page, on the screen, right? So if you're like picking a word, like let's say you're picking the word nervous, and I'd be like, why do you think it's nervous? And you had better have a pretty good answer to that in terms of, I see a clue in the sentence that means that these people are nervous, for sure. If you can't really do that, it's going to be wrong. So we have to be careful with verbal that we are not just kind of picking things that like make sense to us, but that are literally justified by words on the page, on the screen. So this is usually a little bit of nitpicking that we have to do because, a lot of times we'll see a word and it'll kind of make sense, but then we just have to nitpick to make sure there is actually evidence for it or that it must be true logically. Keyword being must. So try this question. I like to just kind of give people a question to play around with in these presentations. So let me know if anybody wants to answer this. You can either raise your hand or you can just put it in the chat. But I'm just curious what you think the answers are here and why. If you did this class or this presentation with me last year, it's the same question. You might not remember it, but does anybody know the answers here? What do you think? Or you can just guess. I'm not going to make fun of you if you get it wrong. Come on, seniors. You guys should be jumping on this. Guys are like, I was not told I would have to do a question today. I'm just going to sit here until he tells us the answer. I will start to make fun of you if nobody tries to answer. Okay, thank you, Carol. Kind of at least Carol saving us here with a guess. B and E. So, and let's think about this. Like, why is there? Carol's right about B. It's irksome, and if we think about it, we're like, what? One good thing to think about too. A couple skills here. Number one, we want to try to predict the blank before we look at the choices if we can. Sometimes it's not always going to work, but we should try because they're very deliberately writing choices to be tricky. They're going to write choices that kind of like make sense, sort of. But if we can predict first, we can sometimes avoid some of those traps. So if we look at the first blank, it's something to the rivals, and we're like, what are the rivals about? Oh, they're complaining. Okay, so if they're complaining, that's supporting irksome. So irksome is right. Irksome means kind of annoyed, right? So we have literal evidence that they're not happy. Perfect. And then what about the second blank? The pair won when their rivals were blank is impressive. Yeah, Carol, I had a feeling you would change it at this point because you were probably just guessing to humor me, to be honest, Carol, because I was, nobody else was doing it. So now that you thought about it, you're like, wait a minute, D makes sense. Terrific is the right answer for blank 2. Because if we look through the sentence again, the pair won when the rivals were blank 2, it's impressive. So that must mean that they were good, right? It wouldn't be impressive if they were bad. So if we look at the choices, nervous doesn't really make sense. Inconsistent definitely doesn't make sense. And we've heard earlier they were in peak form. So terrific is supported. So it's B and D, and you have to get them both right if you want to get credit for the question. So thank you, Carol. That was great. Just some takeaways for us for GRE fill in the blank kind of questions here. We have to be careful. We want to read it and get the main idea. That's fine, but try to predict, and know why you're predicting something. Like have something you can like literally put your finger on to make sure that it's justified. And then bear in mind, they write these they're trying to be tricky, but they're also fair at the same time. In other words, the wrong answers aren't supported and the right answers are. Like they're very, very, very carefully written to be fair. So at the same time, they're trying to trick you. They're also taking great pains to be fair and consistent when they write these questions. So if we look at them, we analyze them, we're like, okay, yeah, irksome. Yeah, I see it. I see where terrific is coming from. At the end of the day, they're going to do that. So we can use that to kind of like, be precise when we do these. So this is, like I said, part of the verbal test. Verbal questions are usually either vocab based like these. And in a way, it's not just vocab, right? It's reading comprehension. But then there's going to be some fill in the blank types where you have to pick two words that mean the same thing and it's the same skill. And then we have stuff like this, which is reading comprehension. The strategies that I usually teach for reading comprehension are a little more robust. It's hard to go over them all like in a presentation like this, but it's kind of the same principle. If you think about it, we need to be literal. We have to pick things that are definitely supported by the text or that must be true given what the text says. So again, something you can't really argue with. The difference here from what you may be used to is a lot of times people are they read the passage a little too carefully. They put too much work into it and they don't put enough work into reading answer choices. And kind of the opposite is what we want to do. I don't really care how you read the passage as long as you can tell me like the basics about it. You don't really have to understand every detail. You should be able to tell me the topic, like Renaissance learning, and you want to be able to tell me the purpose of the passage, like why did the author write about Renaissance learning? Like what was the point of writing about it? To tell us something about what, or to make an argument about something or what. But as long as you have like a layman's terms understanding of that, great. The thing that we need to be really nitpicky with is the wording in the answer choices. Again, they're trying to trick us here. Wrong answers a lot of times are partially right. And then there's a piece or two of them that isn't right. So if you like a choice, it looks familiar to you, you want to nitpick it and just make sure there isn't any part of it that you have like, you don't like, or that rubs you the wrong way, or like, this word is kind of off, because we can find flaws in answer choices and that makes them wrong. So we really have to get used to going through choices word by word sometimes. And that does take some time and effort, but that's where you want to put in a little more time and effort. And usually, yeah, you have to read the passage, but you don't have to understand it the way an expert in this subject matter would. So if you read a sentence and it's just kind of like gobbledygook to you, as long as you understand kind of the bigger picture of the passage, we're probably okay. We don't need you to remember every detail as you read it. And in fact, if it was a longer passage, that would be kind of counterproductive, right? So just something I see a lot where people, once they look at an answer choice word by word, that gives them the focus to be like, oh yeah, that phrase isn't really in the text, or that word is off, or whatever, and they suddenly see what's wrong with the choice. So just something to as a prelude to like how to do reading comprehension. By the way, I'm going to recommend all kinds of resources for you guys at the end. There are plenty of good ones out there that we can use for you, and even those of you taking the test very soon can benefit from them. So let's look at some math questions here. Math is, like I was talking about before, like a lot of math is foundation. So do you know all the math concepts being tested? If you don't, that's kind of your first priority. Strategy is just kind of the icing on the cake. So for this type of question, these are going to be the first, several questions in the math sections. These are called quantitative comparison, where you see like a quantity A, quantity B. You pick A if quantity A is bigger, you pick B if quantity B is bigger, pick C if they're equal, and D if you can't tell. In many cases, you can just kind of figure it out. Like in this case, if you know geometry, you can figure out what X is. But in other cases, you're going to have to use much more of a trial and error approach. And that's one thing I want you guys to get comfortable with, which is kind of weird because like you would never really do this on a math test in high school probably. But for many GRE questions, you're literally just doing trial and error. You're like, okay, what if X is or what if it's 50? What would angle A be? And you can just kind of do trial and error to figure out the question. This is not really a trial and error question, but many of them are where it's very abstract and you just have to make up numbers and try them and see which quantity is bigger in one scenario. And then if you make up a different number, what's quantity is bigger in the second scenario. So that's one thing about the GRE you have to get used to. There are some very specific math strategies for these types of questions. And they're not hard to learn. The foundation is what takes a bit longer, and then building a lot of experience takes longer as well. We have word problems just like you would see on the SAT or the ACT. The SAT and the ACT were probably kind of the same math, but a little easier. GRE is going to be definitely a little trickier for the things it tests. And I'm not going to go into like an algebra lesson here, but certain questions do have kind of hacks to them where if you do use a certain strategy, they're going to become a little bit easier. But again, who's going to do well in GRE math? Not somebody who has all these like tricks. There's usually somebody who actually knows the material. So who could take an algebra test and do well on it in high school? I guess not in high school, but now they could look at that test and be like, oh yeah, I understand algebra. You need to know your concepts. So it takes a while to get that back if you have forgotten them, or for those of you who are like really good in math in high school, you will probably get them back a lot faster, and or you may just know them. It's kind of funny, but when I meet somebody who's like the top of the class in math, they just remember all this stuff. And then the person who with like an A minus doesn't remember any of it sometimes. So it depends on the person. Obviously, these are generalizations, but just something I noticed. It's gonna be very, very variable how long it takes you to get ready for GRE math, depending on your history with math. And depending on some other things too. Okay, so I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on my usual Chipotle analogy. I'm just going to go through this stuff really quick. Quality is more important than brand name when it comes to anything. Even though we all are, as consumers, we're very used to putting a lot of stock in brand names. So when we get to GRE prep, you're going to see certain brand names, but they're not very good. Or at least they're not your best option. Just like Chipotle isn't your best option for Mexican food. Just trust me on that if you're not sure about it. The GRE is like school in some ways, but one thing I was thinking today before I met you guys about like first years and second years and third years, you don't want to think of the GRE like a final. You're like, oh, that's a final I have to take, or that's a midterm I have to take 2 years from now. A midterm or final 2 years from now, even if you don't study for it for months, if you have a month to study for it, you're going to crush it if you study well. GRE is not like that. If you have a month to study for the GRE and you've done no foundational work before that, like you're not a good reader, you're not good with vocab, you're not good with math, that month is not enough. So you really have to prepare for the GRE for a longer period of time. The more foundation you're lacking, the more time it's going to take you. Which is why we want you guys to build your reading ability and math ability now. For those of you who are like, Vince, it's too late for me, I have to take the GRE next month. You can't do as much about the foundation, but you still can do some. And of course, there's lots of other things you can do too. However, we want to think of the GRE as a long-term project in which we're kind of accumulating a lot of things. It's not like a memorization game in a lot of ways. It's a lot about accumulating experience. So again, a little bit dissimilar from a final in school. The one size fits all thing, the main thing I see is that some people will just kind of like go with a certain time frame just because their friends are, or they'll like read something online and be like, oh yeah, here's a 2-month study plan. It doesn't mean it's going to work for you. Again, the more material, the more foundation you need, the longer it's going to take you. Or just the worse you are at tests like this, probably the longer it's going to take you. Can you eventually do well? Probably, but it's just, you want to give yourself enough time to do well. So we can very easily address this for those of you taking the test in the future. Just give yourself more time than you think you need. And then finally, the test optional thing, I just want to mention this briefly because I know there's probably some programs out there who still are test optional for the GRE. In other words, they don't require a score, but real simple, like anything optional for something you're applying to anytime in life, and they're like, oh, you could submit this, but it's optional. Submit it, right? Like, it's a potential advantage. The only time, well, I shouldn't just say submit it blankly, like, or if you absolutely cannot do well, okay, don't submit a score. But guess what? If you don't submit a score, the people are going to assume you didn't do well, right? Like, that's why you didn't submit it. So what I would probably say is, if there's a test optional program, unless you just know you absolutely can never do well at the GRE, think about submitting a score. If, as long as you can do pretty well with the test, it's probably going to help you, because some of your competitors are not going to submit it, and there are going to be more competitors at these test optional programs because it's optional. So I usually like to say, it's just going to be an advantage, a potential advantage, if you can make it happen. The exception is somebody who literally is going to take like a year to prepare and still not do well. Most people are not going to fall into that category, but I have seen it where people are just so, they just never learned any math in high school at all, or something, or their high school didn't require math or something. Okay, that person might have a worse time, and it might be a blessing for that person to have a test optional. But for most people with a decent background in these things, think about taking the test. So just really quickly, when you start preparing, obviously you want to know where you stand and take a practice test. But don't take one completely cold. Like, study for a couple weeks first, because your diagnostic test isn't very diagnostic if you have no clue what's on the test. So you want to at least familiarize yourself with the directions, do some practice, and then maybe see where you stand. It's really important to make sure we do all the ETS material. Those of you preparing for the test right now, there are, I'm pretty sure still, and this is actually important, they have 5 official practice tests on the website. The shorter version is going to make them take off those tests and replace them with short versions of the tests. The bummer about that is they're only replacing 2 of them at first. So we're going to go from 5 full-length tests to 2 short ones. This is really bad, because now we only have like 100 questions to prepare from, and the 5 tests gave us like 400 questions. So what I'm advising my students to do is buy, 2 of them are free, so I don't really mean buy, but I mean like check out with, which like you buy it even though it's free. And then the 3 tests that cost $40 each, buy those now. And that will preserve those tests for 6 months. And you don't want to be in the position where they remove those tests and now you just have those 2 short tests to use. Even though the short tests are what you'll be taking after September 22nd, it just cuts the material. You basically now only have a quarter of the material that you used to have to prepare in terms of practice tests. So I would strongly recommend that if you're going to take the test in the next few months, buy all the practice tests now. At least that way you have them and they're not going to disappear and leave you kind of like without as much material to use. I'm not saying it's better to take the longer test. It's probably much better to take the shorter test, because you'll be more prepared for it, because the more time you study, the better. And the longer version of the test is going away September 20th. Yeah, I wouldn't take the test before the change. That's not my point. My point is preserve the practice test by buying them now. And even though you're going to be taking the shorter test later, at least you'll still have those longer practices to use, which is really valuable because they have tons of questions in them. There's no good reason to take the test before the change for most people. No good reason at all, because normally the longer you wait to take the test, the more prepared you're going to be. So I would definitely recommend everybody take the shorter version of the test if you have a choice, and it's shorter, which is nice, believe me. If you guys have questions about your individual situation, you can also contact me. This tip, calibrate your math learning. So those of you who are studying for math for the test, if you're studying math and you're doing questions in like a book or whatever, but you're getting a lot of them wrong, you need to calibrate and you need to step back and be like, wait, I either need to go slower or I need easier questions, because it's not going to really build your skill to get things wrong. It's also going to be really annoying. So we have ways of doing this. We want to just say, okay, look, I know my study plan says to do all these questions, but I need to find an easier source. Let's think about that just so we can build upon, be accurate. And then eventually get back to those harder questions. So again, this is why we kind of adjust study plans as we go, because not everybody's going to be able to do the same study plan, because some of the questions are hard, and we definitely don't want you wasting your time, like getting things wrong and fighting with all these questions that, you could be just doing easier ones and building your skills that way. And then eventually doing the harder ones. And then accountability is nice too. GRE prep is kind of a lonely endeavor if you're doing it by yourself, and it's kind of hard to be motivated all the time. So having a study buddy really useful, just somebody to kind of bounce your study plan off and be like, hey, what'd you do today? Or do you want to study together? That really helps because it's a long-term project, like I said. And, it's no fun if you're just like sitting there with your books and you're like, I don't want to study today and I'm busy. And having some kind of person to be accountable to is useful. So one final thing I'll say about like test taking and strategies, I'll leave you with this too, because it's probably the most important tip. For those of you taking the test, we want you to get very comfortable with certain test taking strategies in terms of time management. So you may or may not like have time to work on all the questions. Finishing the section is great, but it's not the goal. Maximizing the number of questions you get right is the goal. And usually to that end, it makes sense to guess and skip if you're stuck. If you are not comfortable guessing and skipping when you're stuck, you need to practice that every time you practice. Because if you get stuck in a question, then you sit there for another minute fighting with it, that's a minute you just lost. And you're probably never going to, you're probably still going to get that question wrong. Certain questions are much, much harder than others. The difficulty kind of like varies within a section. So what you want to do is say, okay, look, if this question is not going anywhere, let's guess, let's skip, and let's put it on the back burner. And this is normal. This is good test taking. No matter how good you are at the test, this is going to happen probably. And then just mark it. There's like a little mark tool on the screen so that you can look at like a review screen. You can see all the questions you marked, and then you can click on them and go back to them. And then another little tool around that, like if it's a question that you just know you're never going to get right, like if it's just the vocab is ridiculous, or it's the math concept that you just absolutely have no idea, don't even mark it. Just write its number down in your scrap paper. Be like, don't look at that question again, because it's just a waste of time, right? Just make sure you guess on it, because if it's blank, it's wrong, but don't go back to it. So just have that kind of system. Be like, okay, if I'm going to do a question, great, let's do it. If I need to recheck a question or I want to come back to it, I'm going to mark it. And if I absolutely know this question is bad news, just write the number down on the scrap paper. Don't even mark it. Just guess on it. Never look at it again. But it's very normal to go through a test and have to do this. So don't be that person who just like grinds through the test, even if a question's hard, and spend, like 4 minutes fighting with some randomly hard question. That's going to derail your time management. So just something to realize is going to happen. The test isn't going to go perfectly, so don't expect it to. You're going to get stuck. Just the way the test works. And if you don't get stuck, beautiful, I'm wrong. You can yell at me later. Most of you will get stuck on questions though. So if you do want to work with me, this is, you probably won't, but if you do, I do two things: tutoring, one-on-one tutoring, or a customized study plan, which we sit down, we create a study plan for you, and we update it weekly based on your progress. So this is nice for those of you who want to make sure you're as productive as you possibly can be. This way, I give you feedback on exactly what you should do each week based on, how well you did the previous week. And you get my Discord, which you can kind of discuss questions with me. So in a way, it's like tutoring via Discord. Those of you who want to just kind of connect with me, I guess, to learn vocab, my Instagram, if you like this cartoon here, I do vocab quizzes to teach you vocab, and they use mnemonics like sanguine penguin. So GRE_vocab words. And then my website, of course, is my name, where you can learn more about me and what I do. Another resource that I want to mention is GregMat. So GregMat is just another GRE platform, but super useful because it's super inexpensive. It's an unusual platform, but it's there's GRE platforms out there from every company, but GregMat's great because he is super cheap and really good. And he really focuses on the same things I do, which are like use authentic material, build foundation. He has lots of useful tools in there. So I would highly recommend I'm looking for my font here. Oh, here we are. I would highly recommend checking out Greg Matt as well. There we go. Good stuff on there. Vocab tools, math tools. It's only $7 a month, which is like unheard ofly cheap for test prep. Okay, so that's all I got. What do you guys want to know about the test, if anything? Or those of you taking the test, are there any challenges you're facing that do you think I might be able to help with, or just general questions about anything? So you can either put it in the chat, you can just speak up. There's not that many of us here. I don't think we have to worry about talking over each other too much. Any concerns, questions, things you want to know, complaints about this presentation? Can I submit a sweatshirt idea for the contest?
Of course.
All right. The lowest score is 130. Yes. Yeah, 130 is like a 0, 170 is like perfect, and it's per section. Oh, thanks, Amber. Yeah. And you guys can have these slides if you want. I can email them to you if that's helpful. Uh, they will probably mostly make sense without commentary, but
That was really helpful. And yeah,
yeah,
you have my email, and I'll reach out to you afterwards as well.
sure. Rachel, how did the test go? Anything you learned from taking the test that you didn't know, or anything you want to do differently? Those are usually good questions to tell people about, like, or anything you like, you're like, okay, next time I'm going to do this better. Or you were the ones who took it, Rachel, right? Am I remembering that correctly? Oh, so Rachel says you guys can see this. Oh, the math was so hard. I did find in the verbal, yeah, that's kind of common. Oh, the essay, there's only one essay now. So the issue essay, the one you give your opinion on, is now the only essay. Greg Matt, the resource I just kind of put on here, is a really good resource for the essay. He has 2 essay videos people really like, and he writes an essay in the video, so you can kind of get an example of what he's talking about. And people from all over the world use his stuff successfully, even if English isn't their first language. So if it, yeah, I would definitely recommend that for the essay. That's good, Rachel. You did well in verbal. Yeah, math is tough. It's not an easy thing to fix in a short amount of time. So that's why I was talking about a lot about foundation. But the good news is the math foundation isn't hard math. It's not like calculus or anything. It's just basics, but just like a lot of them. So, what else can I tell you? Or does anybody else have any questions about the test itself, or what kind of math questions stood out to me? Oh yeah. Well, the triangle ones probably stand out to you because they're visual, right? There always are triangle and circle questions, but there's a pretty good mix, to be honest. When I took the test in November, and I was like, they kind of test a little bit of everything. And I think that's on purpose. They hit a lot of different topics. So you will for sure get certain topics, like, you're always going to see geometry. You're always going to see, word problems, arithmetic, integers. But it's just kind of like, it depends on the test, like which questions you see. And on the shorter test, it's going to be interesting because it's half as many questions. So they're going to really have less leeway. It's not really half per se. But they're going to have a lot less leeway to test things. So if you get lucky on the short test, you might not see like your weaknesses. And if you get unlucky, maybe you'll see more of them. So it's going to be a little more luck of the draw with the shorter test, which topics you get. Oh, I don't really know about score ranges for schools. I would probably do research online, like on like Reddit, or the schools sometimes tell you and sometimes they don't really tell you. But yeah, I would just kind of ask around.
On the
Um,
ASHA website, if you search up the school you would like, if you search up like Queens College ASHA or Brooklyn College ASHA, it shows that like the statistics of the school. So the average scores
oh,
that they have, the average amount of students that they accept, and yeah, just details like that.
oh, that's good to know. Yeah, that's actually better than usual. But that's helpful. Yeah, for sure.
You do take the test yourself to kind of refresh on your skills and see what it's like for the next year.
Yeah, the test doesn't usually change. It just happens to be changing this year. But the material doesn't change. So it's the same kinds of questions. But yeah, it's good for me to just kind of see what's on it and just see if there's anything that, you know, is new. But it's a standardized test, so it's very, very hard for them to change like what's on it. So this is a big change because it's shorter now, but they can't really change the material. So like everything we're studying right now for the longer version applies to the shorter version. So we don't have to like there aren't like new questions or new things they're testing. It's just fewer questions. So yeah. The day of the test, what to do? Um, I would probably focus on well-being in the week before the test and be like, okay, am I sleeping well? Am I eating well? Am I exercising? Whatever else you think you need to do to be healthy, because you want to be healthy, like physically and mentally going into the test. And really, the thing that I would always be focused on is the person's test taking plan. I would have a written plan, just very short, like what are my top one or two do's and don'ts for each part of the test. Like, I want to make sure I do this. I want to make sure I don't do this, and write it down. And that's just going to make it a little more likely you remember to do those things, because when you start taking the test, you're going to get it's very, you know, it's very like stressful or exciting, whichever way you label it. And it's kind of, you'll get caught up in the time because you'll be like, okay, it's go time. And it's sometimes easy to forget even the most basic things. So you want to write them down beforehand. So you're like, okay, I want to make sure that I guess and skip if I'm stuck. I want to make sure that I write down, you know, my work neatly, or divide my scrap paper up into 4 sections so I can keep a problem in each section and not get it all over the place. Or I want to make sure I read the question carefully before I pick an answer, or take a deep breath before I read the question. Like little things to kind of avoid typical problems like careless mistakes. Yeah. Oh, in terms of nerves, um, I mean, I don't think, just like anybody who's like, how can I be less nervous doing something? I mean, rehearse it, right? And then mentally rehearse it, and just be okay with the nerves. Like you accepting them as opposed to like fighting them. Like if you get mad at yourself for being nervous, that's probably going to be worse than if you're just like, okay, I'm nervous right now, but that's kind of normal, right? I'm taking a test. Uh, it'll eventually go away, and I'm just going to kind of think of it as energy to like concentrate and um just, you know, tell yourself, you know, accept it as opposed to like getting upset because you're nervous, because then you'll be like more nervous. um but yeah, I think it's just realize is very normal. Everybody's going to be nervous, you know, when you're taking a test like this. And usually as the test goes on, the nice thing of the essays first, so the essay is not as like is I mean, you're just typing stuff, so it's not like it's not as much mental labor maybe. So I think that you, by the time you get to the questions on the test, the nervousness will probably be down a notch. So usually that's the case. I mean, the beginning is the worst part for nerves, I think. Like it's very rare to be at the end of the test and be like, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous right now. Like I think by then you'll just be tired. You're not going to be as nervous. So cool. Anybody else have any questions? Um, well, I don't want to keep you unduly here. Um, yeah, like I said, if you see my website there, you can contact me individually if you just have a random question. I'll send you guys the slides. And yeah, those of you taking the test soon, good luck. Those of you taking the test years from now, yeah, just think about what I said. about your foundation. How can you build it over the years? It's just not going to happen naturally for some of you. So just kind of be proactive about it. And then, yeah, happy to come back again in the future if you guys want to do this again. Thanks for having me back this year. That's always nice. Yeah, good luck with the rest of your year, or year. It's the beginning of a school year.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I know everybody found it really helpful. I learned a lot too, like about the test optional scores. I was just thinking, oh, test optional, I should not as well send it, but yeah, that actually like changed my mind about that as well.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks.
So thank you so much, and I will email you afterwards as well.
Cool. All right. Bye,
Okay.
guys. Thank you.